On the 16th of February 2026, the Pima County Sheriff's Department released an official written statement. On March 10, a reporter confirmed the vehicle's location, a PCSD facility, where it was being reassembled after having been taken completely apart for forensic examination. That trace is ongoing. On February 7, FBI agents arrived at the home of Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni for a second search in 4 days. They came after sunset. They carried a Celebrite UFED, a forensic extraction device capable of recovering deleted calls, text messages, location history, and photographs from digital devices. They left carrying brown evidence bags. One agent's badge, photographed by TMZ on the scene, identified them as affiliated with ICAC, the Internet Crimes Against Children Unit. That affiliation was not explained publicly. The blue Honda CR-V was disassembled entirely for forensic examination. GPS data, door sensor logs, and speed records were extracted and sent to federal analysts. On the 17th of March 2026, multiple sources confirmed that every member of the Guthrie family, including Annie and Tommaso, had passed polygraph examinations. A Ring camera located approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's home captured a vehicle moving southbound at 2:36 inches the morning on February 1. NBC correspondent Liz Kreutz drove the route from Nancy's home to that camera. It takes 6 minutes by car. The vehicle in that footage has been under analysis at the FBI laboratory in Quantico for more than 6 weeks. As of this recording, its make and model remain unconfirmed. On March 11, multiple neighbors reported interruptions to their internet and camera systems during the window of Nancy's disappearance. The neighbor, whose camera had the closest angle to Nancy's property, lost footage entirely during the relevant time frame. A utility box near the house was found damaged. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed that the utility box is part of the active investigation. A rental property located a few blocks from Nancy's home was occupied during the period of the crime and vacated within 48 hours of her disappearance. A forensic team processed the location. The results have not been made public. 2 separate lines of inquiry, 2 separate bodies of work, one moving with the full resources of the federal government, the other constrained, in at least one critical respect, by a decision made at the county level that the federal government explicitly disagreed with. The question that sits at the center of this is not complicated. When the agency with the most expertise requests the evidence, the Sheriff's Department confirmed to Parade magazine that the car had not been returned, and that there was no specific timeline for when it would be. And the agency with the jurisdictional authority declines. What happens to the case? The answer, at 47 days and counting, is that it continues. It grinds forward, the genealogy is being built, the records are being traced, the footage is being analyzed, but one piece of the machinery is running on a longer track than it needed to be because of a single decision made by a man whose own office has contradicted him in public multiple times inside the same investigation. That tension between what is being done and what was decided not to do is where this story becomes something more than a true crime case. It becomes a question about how the American investigative system actually works when the institutions inside it disagree. There is a moment in this investigation that former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole flagged publicly, and it has not been discussed enough. When the Pima County Sheriff's Department announced early in the case that there were no suspects, O'Toole said she found that unusual. In her experience, making that kind of declaration loudly and quickly carries a specific risk. A perpetrator who is monitoring the news. So, here is the question this video is going to answer. If a sheriff makes an official public statement about a post, watching press conferences, tracking what law enforcement is saying, may interpret that announcement as a signal that the pressure is off, that the search has narrowed away from them, that they can breathe. Whether that is what happened here is unknown. What is known is that, on March 12, the same sheriff who made the no-danger declaration on February 2 told NBC that the suspect could absolutely strike again. He offered no explanation for the distance between those two assessments. He did not acknowledge the earlier statement. He simply said the new thing, as if the old thing had never been said. In the same March 12 interview, Nanos said something else. "We believe we know why he was here, and we have known since day one." That claim, if accurate, raises a question that cuts directly to the heart of how this investigation has been managed. If the motive has been understood since February 1, what has been done with that understanding? What has it produced? piece of physical evidence in a federal investigation, and that statement is demonstrably false within 10 days. Because 47 days later, no arrest has been made, no suspect has been named publicly, and the family of Nancy Guthrie is still waiting. Meanwhile, the vehicle belonging to Annie and Tommaso was held for more than 40 days, while the family had been officially cleared since February 16. In that same period, a separate Tucson residence was raided by a SWAT-style operation on February 13. The man detained in that raid was released without charges. His vehicle was returned in approximately 2 weeks. Former PCSD SWAT commander Bob Krieger has explained the logic of holding a vehicle in a case like this. To create a case as rock-solid as possible, built for a jury, that framing implies a direction. It implies a destination. What it does not do is reconcile the gap between the February 16 clearance statement and the continued retention of the car. A rental property located a few blocks from Nancy's home adds another layer to what remains unresolved. What else in the public record of this case needs to be looked at again? It was occupied during the period surrounding the abduction. It was vacated within 48 hours of Nancy's disappearance. A forensic team processed the location. As of this recording, the results of that processing have not been made public. And through all of it, the recall campaign continues. The same man making these decisions, signing these contracts, issuing these statements, is the subject of an active effort to remove him from office. That is the environment in which the central evidence of a federal investigation is being managed. If you have been following cases like this for any length of time, this channel is built for the way you watch. Not speculation, not drama, the record, examined carefully. Subscribe if that is what you are here for, because this case is not finished, and neither is this coverage. Here is what the people who have spent careers inside the FBI are actually saying about where this case stands, because the car is not the only thing that does not add up. Stripped of the press conference language and the official statements, Tracy Walder spent years at both the CIA and the FBI. Her analysis of this case centers on a reframe that changes everything that preceded it. Nancy Guthrie was not the target. Savannah Guthrie was. Nancy, an 84-year-old woman living alone with a pacemaker and a pink cane, was the access point. The easiest point of contact in a family that includes one of the most publicly visible broadcast journalists in the United States. According to Walder, the architecture of this crime was built around Savannah, and Nancy was the door through which the perpetrators believed they could reach her. If Walder is right, then the ransom demands take on a different shape. The notes sent to TMZ, to local Tucson news outlets, to KGUN and KLDO, notes that contain details about Nancy's Apple Watch and the broken floodlights at the rear of her property. Details that had not been publicly released at the time they arrived were demanding $6 million. It is not the second thing, or the third. Former FBI behavioral analysts James Fitzgerald and Raymond Carr, analyzing the case through their podcast Code Red, traced that number. Their finding: the $6 million figure corresponds to research into Savannah Guthrie's salary. Someone looked up what she earns, and they built the ransom demand around that number. That is not opportunism. That is planning, extended over time, by someone who was building toward this. But former FBI Deputy Assistant Director John Miller has offered an interpretation of those same notes that cuts in a different direction. The crime, Miller said, went wrong immediately, and the ransom demands, in his assessment, may not represent a kidnapper negotiating for a living hostage. They may represent something else entirely, an attempt to re-engineer the narrative after the fact, to reconstruct what happened as an abduction, to create the appearance of a living victim after Nancy was already dead. The notes contain non-public details, which means whoever wrote them had been inside that house, but no proof of life was ever attached to any of them. There is a pattern here, a pattern of official statements that contradict each other, deadlines passed with no contact. No channel for negotiation was ever established. Derek Kalla of California was arrested for submitting one fraudulent note, an opportunist trying to extract money from a family's desperation. His phone is in federal evidence. He did not write all of them. The ones that contained insider details came from somewhere else, and what they may represent, according to Miller, is a cover story written by someone who needed the world to believe Nancy was still out there. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, speaking on March 10, said the search phase is over. Former intelligence analyst Morgan Wright, who was physically present in Tucson during the investigation, reached a conclusion he stated plainly: targeted abduction gone wrong. Nancy, in his assessment, did not survive. The family has received no official notification. There has been no public confirmation. But listen to what Savannah's own language did between February 7 and February 24. On February 7, she said, "We will pay." Of decisions made at the local level that federal sources have described in words that leave nothing to interpretation, on February 24, she stood before cameras alone and said, "She may already be gone. She may have already gone home to the Lord. That shift is not nothing." A daughter does not say those words unless something has changed in what she believes. Now set all of that against the management of the investigation. If the crime went wrong immediately, and if the ransom notes were written afterward to redirect attention, then the DNA recovered from inside Nancy's home is not the DNA of a kidnapper waiting for payment. It is the DNA of someone who was there when something went wrong, and who left, and who has been living with that since February 1. That DNA is currently at a private lab in Florida. The FBI asked for it to go to Quantico. The answer was no. Share this, because the question of whether that decision has slowed the identification of the person who left that sample is not a hypothetical. It said that the blue Honda CR-V belonging to Annie Guthrie and her husband Tommaso Cioni had been processed. Past tense, done, finished. Of a case where the gap between what is being said and what is actually happening has grown wider with every press conference. It is the central question of where this case stands on day 47. The DNA is being processed. The backpack is being traced through Walmart purchase records, a trail that narrows with every transaction reviewed. The vehicle captured on the Ring camera at 2:36 inches the morning is still under analysis at Quantico. 6 weeks in, make and model not yet confirmed. The utility box near Nancy's home remains part of the active investigation. The rental property, that was vacated within 48 hours, has been processed by a forensic team whose findings have not been released. C.C. Moore, of Parabon Nanolabs, has resolved more than 300 cases using forensic genetic genealogy. She said 4 words about this one: he will be identified. That statement was made with full knowledge of where the samples are and how the methodology works. The genealogy builds outward from a partial DNA match in a public database, one family branch at a time, until a name becomes verifiable. It does not require a prior record. It does not require the suspect to have ever interacted with law enforcement. That pattern is what this video is about. It requires that someone in their biological family tree voluntarily uploaded their own genetic profile to a consumer genealogy platform. Given how many people have done exactly that in the last decade, the question is not whether the methodology will work. It is when. The Ozark Trail backpack, sold exclusively at Walmart, gives investigators a purchase trail that exists in a corporate database. Every transaction leaves a record. The FBI is working through that record. At some point, the records narrow to a specific date, a specific store, and a method of payment. Cash purchases complicate that timeline. Card purchases do not. On March 12, Sheriff Nanos said his office has known since day one why the suspect was there. Former FBI Supervisory Special Agent Steve Moore offered a different kind of summary, one that is less about what is known and more about what the path forward actually requires. The only people who know what happened are the people who committed it, not the crime itself, which was covered in detail in our previous video. $1 million in reward money, offered by Savannah Guthrie, remains unclaimed. That money is available to anyone with information. It has been available for weeks. The silence around it is its own kind of data point. Day 47, no arrest. The labs are running, the records are being traced, and somewhere between a Florida DNA facility and a Quantico analysis room and a Walmart transaction database, the case is moving, just not as fast as it could have been. Let's talk about what this case actually teaches, because there are things here that go beyond Nancy Guthrie, beyond Tucson, beyond true crime. Start with jurisdictional structure. Most people who follow cases like this assume the FBI runs the show once it gets involved. That is not how American law enforcement works. Federal agencies can investigate, advise, and contribute resources. But in a case that originates on local soil, the local agency retains significant authority. This one is about the system that is supposed to solve it, and what happens when that system starts working against itself. A sheriff can decline an FBI request. a county contract can override a federal preference. The Pima County decision to send DNA to a private Florida laboratory instead of to Quantico is not a scandal in the legal sense. It is a lawful exercise of jurisdictional authority. What this case teaches us about that structure is that lawful and optimal are not the same thing, and the gap between them can have consequences that play out over weeks and months in a real investigation. Then there is the question of public statements and suspect behavior. What this case illustrates about the psychology of official communication is something researchers in criminal behavior have documented. Perpetrators monitor coverage. They watch press conferences. Former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole's concern about the early no suspects announcement is grounded in that reality. When an investigating agency signals publicly that it has ruled out broad categories of suspects, it is not just informing the press. It is potentially informing the person it is looking for. Stay with this, because the specific decision that federal sources called, in their exact words, dumb and insane, is coming. The lesson is not that agencies should lie to the public. It is that the timing and framing of official statements in active investigations carry strategic weight that is often underestimated. Finally, what this case reveals about the relationship between political accountability and investigative decision-making is a question that deserves serious attention. A recall campaign does not mean a sheriff is acting in bad faith, but it does mean that every major decision he makes exists within a context that includes his own political survival. What this case teaches us about institutional design is that the most consequential investigative choices, which lab gets the DNA, which agency processes which evidence, should not rest in the hands of a single elected official navigating a simultaneous fight for his own job. That is a structural problem, not a character judgment. And it is a problem that exists in jurisdictions across the country, not just in Pima County. On March 1, Annie Guthrie stood in front of her mother's house for the first time in 22 days. And once you hear what that decision was and what it was made instead of, you will understand why the people who work in this field. She had said nothing publicly since February 7. She left a card on the doorstep. It read, "Though we are surrounded by so much darkness, our love burns bright. We love you, Mommy." That is not a statement written for a camera. That is a daughter writing to a woman she cannot reach, leaving something at a door because there is nothing else left to do. The DNA is running. The backpack is being traced. The genealogy is being built, one branch at a time, toward a name. $1 million is waiting for the person who provides the information that breaks this open. On the day that happens, this channel will cover it the same way we covered this, with the record, with the experts, and with every verifiable fact that exists. If this kind of coverage matters to you, like this video and follow the channel. People who spent careers at the FBI and the CIA are watching this case with something that looks a great deal like disbelief, because the next development in this case is coming. And when it does, you will want to have been here. Chris Nanos is the sheriff of Pima County, Arizona. His office is the agency of record for the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. The FBI is deeply involved, but the structural authority for the case sits with Nanos. The statement also said that the entire Guthrie family, including all siblings and their spouses, had been cleared as possible suspects. He controls what gets said publicly. He controls which lab receives which samples. He controls the timeline of what the press and the family are told and when they are told it. He is also, at this moment, the subject of a recall campaign. A movement to remove him from office is actively underway, running in parallel with the most high-profile investigation his county has seen in years. That is not an accusation. It is a fact in the public record, documented across multiple transcripts covering this case. It is context, and context matters when you are trying to understand why a person in authority makes the decisions they make. On March 12, Nanos said something in an interview with NBC that has not received the attention it deserves. He said, "We believe we know why he was here, and we have known since day one." Read that again. Since day one. The sheriff of Pima County is claiming that his office has understood the motive behind this crime since February 1, the morning Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was reported. If that is true, it raises a question that Nanos has not answered publicly. Why has that knowledge not translated into an arrest? 10 days later, a CBS 5 reporter named Brianna Whitney asked the sheriff's department directly about that vehicle. What it has translated into, at least in the public record, is a series of statements that do not hold together. On February 2, Nanos told the public there was no danger to the community. On March 12, the same man told NBC that the suspect could absolutely strike again. Those two assessments were made by the same sheriff, about the same suspect, 40 days apart. Both cannot be true. Neither was retracted. When reporters asked, in the early days of the investigation, who had driven Nancy home on the night of January 31, the answers from Nanos' office cycled through 4 variations. Annie drove her. Tommaso drove her. Annie and Tommaso drove her together. The family brought her home. The answer that eventually became the official version was Tommaso, alone. 4 different answers to a question that has exactly one correct response. These are not the kinds of inconsistencies that emerge from a fast-moving investigation where facts are still being established. The answer she received had nothing to do with the answer given on February 16. A question about who drove a specific vehicle to a specific address on a specific night is not ambiguous. It has an answer. The answer existed on February 1. It did not require weeks of investigation to determine, and yet it took multiple corrections before the sheriff's department settled on one. That is the environment in which the most consequential decision of this entire investigation was made. Start with what the evidence actually is. Inside Nancy Guthrie's home, investigators recovered a DNA profile. Male, unknown. Mixed, meaning the sample contains genetic material from at least 2 separate individuals. When that profile was run against CODIS, the national criminal database maintained by the FBI, there was no match. The person or persons whose DNA was left in that house had no prior record in the federal system. That result, in a different investigative environment, would have triggered an immediate next step. Send the samples to the FBI's National Crime Lab at Quantico, Virginia. The car, she was told, was still part of the active investigation. Quantico is not simply the best forensic laboratory available to American law enforcement. It is specifically designed for exactly this kind of case. The infrastructure, the expertise, the capacity to integrate DNA analysis with behavioral profiling and database cross-referencing, it exists at Quantico in a way it does not exist anywhere else. The FBI asked for the samples to be sent there. Sheriff Nanos said no. Instead, he signed a contract with DNA Labs International, a private facility located in Deerfield Beach, Florida. The value of that contract was approximately $200,000. The samples went to Florida. Federal sources, people inside the system who understood exactly what had just happened, described that decision to reporters in 2 words: dumb and insane. Not one source, not an anonymous posting. Federal sources, on record, using those specific words about a decision made by a county sheriff in a case that the FBI was actively investigating. No correction was issued. No explanation was offered. The implications of that decision extend beyond the immediate question of which lab processes the samples fastest. Forensic genetic genealogy, the methodology being used by C.C. Moore of Parabon Nanolabs, who has resolved more than 300 cases, and who has publicly said about this one that he will be identified, depends on the quality and completeness of the DNA extraction. The chain that leads from a mixed profile to a name in a family tree to a suspect at a door requires that the starting material be handled with the highest possible precision. Moore has committed to a result. She made that commitment knowing where the samples are. But the path to that result is longer than it needed to be. Is there a reason Nanos declined Quantico? None has been offered publicly. The decision was made. The contract was signed. The DNA went to Florida. The 2 statements simply exist in the public record, side by side, pointing in opposite directions. And the FBI, the agency that recovered deleted footage from a device with no cloud subscription, that spent 11 days working alongside Google engineers to reconstruct what a camera with no active subscription had captured, that is cross-referencing purchase records with Walmart for a specific backpack model, that sent the contents of a vehicle to its own labs for GPS and door sensor analysis, that agency was told it could not have the DNA. Think about what that means for the investigation. The comment section on this video is the right place to weigh in. Does a sheriff facing a recall campaign have a conflict of FOD interest when he is making decisions about which institution handles the central evidence in a case of national significance? The people in this community who have been following this closely have thoughts worth reading. What the FBI has been doing with what it does control is a different story entirely. On February 10, FBI Director Kash Patel stood before cameras and announced that agents had recovered footage from Nancy's Nest camera, with no one in an official capacity acknowledging the gap between them. The device had no cloud subscription. There was no automatic backup. What existed was residual data on a back-end server infrastructure, the kind of trace that requires both the legal authority and the technical capacity to access. The FBI spent 11 days working alongside engineers from Google to reconstruct 6 still images and 3 short video clips from that server. What those images show is a figure in a balaclava, carrying an Ozark Trail 2.5-liter backpack, wearing gloves, carrying a weapon, at Nancy's front door. Former FBI profiler Jim Clemente analyzed that footage independently. His conclusion: the footage is detailed enough to identify what appears to be a tattoo on the suspect's right wrist. The backpack itself became one of the most significant physical leads in the case. Sheriff Nanos called it exactly that, one of the most promising physical leads we have. The Ozark Trail 2.5-liter model is sold exclusively at Walmart. The FBI moved to coordinate with Walmart on purchase records, working to identify when and where the specific unit captured on camera was bought.